the reduction and contextual integration, he talks about how like a project of conceptual reorganization. I was like, I'd love to make a framework for that and then start doing that. That's what inspired that whole conceptual frequency thread of like, finding those concepts that do the work, and then not just in objectivism, but in thinking in general. Okay.
For sure. Okay, here, what page? Probably about 9.
I am
or
on
12.
page, I'll tell you in a second, page 12.
I found it.
Yeah, you can skip the blue and then here I've highlighted it as well, so you should be able to. So he's talking about Neville Chamberlain, actually.
Yes, I see it.
Okay, all knowledge depends on a certain relationship. It is based on a context of earlier information. And then he actually gives a definition here, which is not helpful, I find, but and then this sum is what enables us to reach. Maybe this is a bit more helpful. The sum is what enables us to reach a new conclusion, to prove it, to interpret it, to apply it. It sets the item's relationship to reality and thus the item's meaning and proper use. Always hold the context. All right. Then he talks about, let's see. Oh, that's in my question. So if one drops the context, one drops the means of distinguishing between truth and fantasy. Anyone can then claim to prove anything, however absurd. So, okay, that's sort of the question from before, which we can skip. That's an ongoing thing I need to look at, but we just skip that. So it gives an example of Neville Chamberlain's argument in favor of appeasing Hitler. I don't know if you remember that. He says it's context dropping because he treats Hitler's demand to take over Czechia or whatever it was, I don't know, as an isolated fact, while he's saying the demand in relation to knowledge about Nazism, in relation to history of similar demands from aggressor nations. He ignores ethics, political philosophy, history, psychology, ethics, and more.
Yes.
But I was thinking, does this Neville guy even have the context of any of that? Because I know I don't. Maybe Landon Peacock does, but I don't. And then if you don't have the context, then that's just ignorance, right? It's not like so.
It can be.
Dropping the context would be evasion. Then is that what I'm sort of trying to find out? Because that's what
I would think a form of evasion would sound correct. Yes, if you already know what you're, you're closing your eyes to everything around you. Like it's like treating it like in a vacuum. Like imagine, forget even Neville Chamberlain. Just pretend you're like a negotiator in a hostage situation. Like, do you just give them hostage taker whatever they want, because then you don't treat their demand as like one isolated thing. It's like they say they want $1 million, you give it to them, the hostages are let go. It's like, no, you wouldn't want to have just that. You want to keep in mind, well, he's taking hostages, he might be lying, or the context of like, is there some political motive behind this guy? Do we need to consider like, is he part of an organization? Is he trying to trick you? Or all these kind of other questions. Like, you don't want to treat it in isolation, just like, oh, you asked for one thing and that's all I do. You don't want to treat it in a vacuum. Or like with Hitler, like Neville Chamberlain should have taken more into account. Well, what kind of man is Hitler? What sort of things does he want? What's the political situation in Europe these days? He seems to totally isolate, just say like, if I give Hitler what he wants, he's happy, no war, done. But that's very simple-minded. You're forgetting the context of where you are, who you're dealing with, the time, the year it is, things like that.
Yeah. I guess in that example of the hostage, you'd almost need to. I can see how if there was an urgency, then you may have time to ask a lot of questions. But in the case of urgency, suddenly you're dependent on your previous thoughts, in that whatever you've automatically coded into your subconscious, sometimes when there's urgency, it's too hard to think properly. Like you are dependent on previous thoughts. So in that case, it wouldn't be evasion, because it's just like a failure of knowledge. But then
You're right. That's true.
But then in the case of I can see how when you do have, if you did somehow have lots of time to think and ask questions and you chose not to, then it would be evasion.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, this is kind of a minor point. I was asking those questions because I was still trying to get at like, okay, well, how does context relate to, evasion and that kind of thing? Because I wasn't really clear on context.
Yeah, that would be a good example, I think, the way you described that.
Right. All right. Well, we can, until I get back, I'll have to go back over this context thing for sure, but
yeah,
until we can skip it for now. Blue just means I'm going to come back to it.
Yeah. Yeah, this is kind of reiterating what I said. Like, every proposal and every idea must be judged in the light of the total picture. So like we were saying about Neville Chamberlain, you have to judge the idea in the context of who Hitler is, the political situation in Europe, the different questions like that, or like, what does Britain need out of this negotiation? All those sort of questions. You don't want to treat it in a vacuum. Like you're like turning the blinders on to everything else around you.
The difficulty for me though is I mean, we can take this out of the more extreme examples of either hostage situations or Hitler taking over a country and then go to like career choice. Like, what is the context for that? Because it's not as simple as you think. It might include things like the tax rate. It might include the country you live in. It might include your view on the monetary system. Like, it just all kinds of random things that are not obvious. And so, anyway,
those would be questions of context, and the challenge of objectivity is to determine what's irrelevant maybe to your question, and that's of course the hard part. Like you want to try to figure out, you don't want every single fact to be considered. You don't need every little detail. Like you don't need the color of your hair to figure out what to do in your career. You can like say it's part of the context and scare quotes, but it's not like relevant.
And maybe
that's
you want
the challenge of objectivity. Yeah, and that's kind of the role of concepts. Like concepts help reduce like these side considerations that we need. Like you can abstract away color of your hair and things like that.
Okay. We'll go to the next. There may be quite a bit of repeat here, as I'm like, clearly I was confused by, so we can skip stuff that's just a pure repeat. Let me just have a look at this. Yeah, okay, I guess this is back to, so he's saying, because the things he was saying just seem, I see no way how to implement them, but like the context one must hold, therefore we can ignore this question because I sort of asked it before about the crocodile and physics. All knowledge is interrelated. Every element of it is potentially relevant to the rest. The context one must hold, therefore, is not a mere fragment or subdivisions of one's knowledge, however extensive, but everything known at that stage of development, the sum of available knowledge. I'm like, oh my God, how do I integrate if I learn something new? How the hell do I, how do I identify its implication for everything? It just seems impossible. The only way to ensure that one's knowledge is a sum that is a consistent whole. This is the only way to ensure such knowledge as a whole. Which requires, so such consistency is not a given, but an achievement which requires a methodical, effort-demanding process. Yeah, anyway, what are your thoughts on that? Where I'm reading that, I'm going, how that, like, cool, I'd love to be able to do that, but that just seems impossible to me. Like,
well, first off, this section that you have here, the whole quote, is basically that whole section I mentioned about in the Peikoff lecture. I mean, this is basically what he addresses directly. Like this exact question. And just to give a taste of the answer, it'd be like asking, well, if you know about crocodiles, what does it mean? How do you know about crocodiles? What is it that Like, I mean, you say, well, I read a book about crocodiles. I mean, you could go back on like, well, I'm not going to confuse you. Just listen to the lecture. I can't really get into
okay, and then
more than I did. And then you can ask questions from there, I would say.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll just write that down. And I will blue this as well.
And that whole lecture should, or that whole, it's like an hour or an hour and a half, I think.
Oh, that's nothing.
That first
really?
one should help you a lot with these questions you're having.
So
like they all relate in some way to like context and how you find out what it, like those sort of questions.
yeah. Is that so the whole course is just 1 hour?
No, that's, well, there's lesson one of 4 courses.
Okay,
There's
good.
or it's 4 lessons in one course.
Yeah. Okay,
That's
cool.
what it is.
So I will get onto that. Do you reckon maybe I should just get onto that right after, like while I'm still reading this book, because if it helps me understand.
At least that one. At least that one.
Yeah, okay.
It's not gonna make anything harder because it's about what you already read, and I think it's really important to understand. So I would dive into that because it's only an hour and a half. Like if you wanted to listen to everything, and only 20 minutes if you just needed one question.
Yeah, okay, cool. I will skip ahead to the. Okay, all right. So this is about the question of method, which I'm highlighting. If you skip down, you can see. So we can keep this in mind when we read it. But it's a question of what is this method? How do you implement it while learning in general? And then a systematic framework for questioning, integrating beliefs, concepts, principles. Where would you even begin? That's sort of what I had in mind when I was reading this, because I was like, cool, this sounds awesome. I want to do it, but I don't know how the hell I'd do this. So the Okay, so this is the section. All right, so this makes sense. Your mind cannot compare old contents and new in a flash of synoptic insight. It can't hold in a single frame of awareness. Let me just move this so I'm not looking at a different screen. Okay, yeah, it can't hold in a single frame of awareness all the relevant former ideas and the new items being considered, which goes back to what that previous question of like, how would you do it? You can't just hold all your knowledge and then go, there's the implication there. It needs to be done in a methodical way. He says one step at a time, and then relate a new item to previous ideas. So still, again, it's still a puzzle thing of like there are millions of items, so I still don't know. But anyway, and then it's methodically surveyed. So logic requires non-contradictory identification within full context of one's knowledge, methodically survey. So there's some method, and then it gets down to you can't do it in a day or a week. A major reorganizations of one's thought is a demanding task. I was still like, awesome, I want to do that, but so it's a demanding task. We know that, and then he's saying. Thought is identification and integration, asking of what and then so what. So it's you've got it. That's what I was saying earlier with get the concept, then find whatever the implications are for all the knowledge. But the question is, what would be like, obviously there's something like if you want to approach it in a way that makes sense, you'd start with the most important things, but then there's no method. It's still kind of open-ended. Like, anyway, just any thoughts on?
In a way, that's what objectivity is. Like he's just saying, well, we need a method to do this. That method is objectivity. Objectivity is all these things I talked about in the chapter. It's complicated and difficult, but these are the sort of things we ask when we think about objective thinking. We ask these sort of questions like, what's the context, or what's the essential, or why does it matter? Identification, integration, like you got all those things, you put them together and that's your method. And of course that's a lot, but that's kind of like the point. That's what he's trying to say. There's all these questions and we need to do these. Like we can ask, what is integration? That's more a deeper epistemological question. You could ask, what does it mean to identify? That's a deeper question, but you need both of those things. And then differentiation, what is that? How does it happen? I mean, that's something you need for objective thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So there's probably a bunch of okay, the chapter on objectivity gives questions like you need to relate it to each previous knowledge. You may have a specific set of questions for that. I guess I was looking for like an actual like it's almost like a page with a list of questions I could go through that, but there's no, it doesn't exist. Um,
Well, in a sense, you could say, what's the method? It's objectivity. Objectivity means identification, integration, differentiation, I mean,
yeah,
things like that. You could do that.
I could make my own sheet, I guess.
Yeah,
Um, but
the key
then
points of objective thinking.
But then it would go back to that thread of the which are the concepts that you'd start with that would make the most sense because you can approach things with the logical order like with it if I was just concerned with objectivism, which I'm not, then you might go, okay, well, these are the concepts that do the most work, rationality. But then if you're approaching it from actual just conceptual reorganization of
Right.
everything, then there is still that question of what does it make sense to begin with to clarify and make sure that you're holding objectively, what concepts.
Yeah, I see what you mean. That's outside of objectivism. Why would you, like, where do you begin? I think that is a hard question. I almost say you begin just whatever strikes you as relevant. And I know that's not really a satisfying answer, but it's on some level, I think you just need to jump in and just try reaching around and see what works. And like, oh, you want to know the truth. And that's the general idea I have. But like, yeah,
Yeah.
there's some groping, there's some like confusions, and you might not know where you're going. And I think that's natural to happen. And then over time, you just maybe you have to keep in mind that as you learn different things, like, well, you can learn that, yes, in fact, I can find a clear way of thinking about concepts. Like, yes, in fact, I can find a way to relate five different objects together into one thing and think about them like consistently. Or you could, and things like that. And over time, you just keep just integrating all that in. I guess that's presupposing some things, but it just in a way you're if you want to get at the truth, you just on some level you're probably just thinking with logic to begin with what's consistent. I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, maybe just jumping in and then also going to concepts that um, aren't necessarily deep, but that, you think about a lot, like maybe work as a concept or effort or I don't know, and then that might lead you somewhere else. I guess it's just something to start with and then
Right.
find
And you
out.
can
That's
expand
probably,
from there your understanding based on
yeah.
what you've learned in your job. Like can widen it to like, oh, I want to think about more than just work. I want to think about, well, how do I then broaden this to my life?
Mm,
You could ask that. Like,
right.
yeah, like develop like in a chronological developmental sense, just like begin with what's in front of you
Yeah.
in a way that's like resembling what kids do. Like you're not trying to worry about what you're not thinking about a deep philosophical question about dogs when they have
Mm,
a concept of dogs, or
yeah.
they're taking what's in front of them, what's available to them, and working from there.
Yeah.
And over time, they eventually get at, oh, what does it mean for something to be true, or and things like that, and just learn more over time.
Yeah, that makes
And
sense.
it's
That
okay
would,
to jump in sometimes. And
yeah.
even Peacock, I think you're saying like there was something in this lecture, like you're saying like we should talk about this, but we'll just jump into it. Like he's not. He set the content. He set the discussion uh, a little bit beforehand, but basically he had everybody just jump into thinking about it, even if it was hard. So like just we'll jump into it, think about it, go from there.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what he did.
Yeah. Um, yeah, okay. I think as I start working through this, I'll start putting things together and figuring out a way to, and then obviously do it, and then from there adjust based on the work I'm doing and what's working, what's not working.
Yeah,
So can,
I mean, I'm not just saying just do a trial and error sort of thing. I mean, we are going through it in a systematic way, and through the book in a specific way, and sometimes specific questions though are better just jumping in and trying it out.
I mean,
sometimes.
I don't mean pure random trial and error. I mean, yeah, when you start something, like things come up that you didn't anticipate or conceptualize, and so then that's how you learn that. Because until you do it, you just don't know. Okay, cool. This is probably a repeat. Some of these would be repeats. Let's have a look. Similar themed questions.
How do you know the connections? I'd say it's just a different form of what you just asked.
Yeah, me too. What is the new ethics? Yeah, it's the same question of like this method of doing it, which is pretty cool, but I don't know, it's a good example, so I guess I could probably leave it. So I'll make it blue.
Just as a practical way to even think about that, just making connections between things. Like, say if you want to make connections about computers, you could just say, okay, I've got a computer. You could think of, well, what was necessary to invent a computer? You could ask a question like that. You could say, well, one, you need electricity. And that's a way of connecting like computers to electricity. Or you could then, another question could be, I know, silicon, because silicon microchips. So it's like, well, that's a connection to computers. It's just, it doesn't necessarily need to be really weird or complicated. It could just be something as simple as that if you're just considering like technology.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess they're all associations that we have.
Maybe more than associations, because there's like a causal relationship you're saying there that you have to know about electricity in order to create computers. It's not just like an association, like bananas make you happy. I mean, that's or that.
Yeah, you're right.
Turkeys and pilgrims or something.
It's more than an association.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's assuming you've retained the right things as being important and you focused on those things. Like,
correct.
Yeah, cool. All right. What's this? Oh, okay. These are just general questions. This is a knowledge as hierarchical.
Yes.
I don't know how to say that. Is it hierarchical or hierarchical? I think.
I don't really know.
Yeah.
I just say hierarchical. Okay, I say hierarchical.
Whatever. Who cares? Okay. The basic distinction between hierarchical concepts is simply, this is just a general question for this section.
Yeah.
High level and first level. High level means you can't point to a referent and it is not reached directly from the concretes. Is that right? There's just that basic distinction. There's high level and first level. High level is can't point to a referent. First level is can point directly to a concrete. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fair. Higher level, you can also say further away from a referent. But if you could say can't point to a referent, if that helps you, I mean, that works too.
Further away from a referent.
Yeah, I mean, like you could have.
That's another characteristic. Okay.
Like distance could be like if you're talking about. Well, just to use your like difference between a shape versus a rectangle, say. Or maybe that's not a good example, but
I hated that thing. I spent ages. It's like I didn't see what the point of that was. That was funny.
Yeah. Oh, but yeah, that's fine.
Whatever.
I think you're fine there.
We've answered. We've already gotten onto this. Chronology is the way you learn, and then logical. It's still pretty confusing though, to be honest, because like you'd think that something chronological is logical. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
well,
if you need to learn in a certain order, and then like, it's strange to call it logical if you arrange it in another order that you can't learn it in.
Did Peikoff say logical hierarchy?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
I think I may have. It might be clearer just say logical structure.
Oh, okay.
Might be more sense.
Okay.
And the logical structure could have hierarchy in it, based from like axioms to then more specific concretes. that's what I would mean by logical. And chronological just being how you learn over time. Say, as a child, what do you know first? And what do you begin with before you can understand, say, a concept like gravity? Like, you don't start with gravity. You can't really begin there. You're going to start with, like, well, if you're a child, you're going to begin with, like, dropping a block. Like, it's not even, like, complicated.
So what makes then the logical structure in philosophy? Like, okay, what would be the logical structure and what would be the chronological structure? Is there such a thing as a chronological structure? Like the
You could call
logical,
it developmental if you want.
yeah, okay. And then,
Um,
so what makes like the order of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, art, a logical structure? And then what would be the chronological structure or chronological order?
when I say logical structure, I just need to say there's a foundation with which different concepts rest. Like, your foundation has to begin with those undeniable things like existence, consciousness, and identity. And like that has to undergird everything, that
Mm-hmm.
supports everything. And then you could have conclusions based on those or related to those, like causality.
Yeah.
And you could just go from there in its structure, logical structure, in terms of what each concept would have to depend on
Yeah,
to
okay.
even exist in the first place.
It's
And developmental being just like the way you come to see the world. Like, you don't begin with seeing existence abstractly. Like, you have to begin with seeing like dogs and blocks and apples and things like that.
Yeah,
And you just go from there.
I guess you see existence, but you don't formulate it conceptually.
Correct.
Is the and what yeah, okay. It's a weird thing to think about that we form concepts that depend on other things, but we don't learn those other things until later.
Yeah, I think Rand usually calls those implicit concepts because we would need to understand those, or if we, it would be important to know, but we're not directly aware of it. We're not maybe totally making a recognition of it explicitly yet. I mean, existence is always there, whether or not we realize. It's implicit, and eventually we might recognize that it was there all along. That's the best way I could think of it.
Yeah. It's I don't know, it's just strange that like I get it's more abstract, but just the idea in my head of like there are all these things that your thinking depends on, but when you learn to think, you learn things that the thinking depends on, but you learn no, you learn the things that you need to think, but not the things that the thinking depends on. That's a mouthful, but
Well,
like
you could
it's
maybe a
like
different way.
you're like it's like you're floating around the sky in like the what is it 24th story buildings and you're living there, but to learn you don't learn by building the structure from the ground up, which is I don't know, I'm just confused about how that's the logical structure is from the ground, but you don't learn from the ground up, you learn
Maybe
from
another way to think of this is that the chronological or developmental would be particular to you as an well, individual people, how they learn, but logical structure just being what people know in general, like what, like you don't know about maybe microbiology, and maybe and you don't know anything about maybe like rocket science, but someone does, and could say in that way there's some structure of the knowledge that's out there. Like, imagine the way you structured Wikipedia. I mean, you don't know everything on Wikipedia yourself, but you know that knowledge is there, and there's a logical structure to all of that, even if you're not aware of every little fact. You can say there is a structure to it, and the developmental part is discovering what the structure is.
Yeah, I need to think about this one more. It's still pretty. I get it. Like I understand that. I can completely get. Okay, when I'm a child, I'm looking at things around a room. I'm seeing like, okay, cup, person. I learn to identify mum, dad. I don't think about existence exists, causality. Ah, look at me, shake my little causality. Like that's not how I think when I'm a kid. But it's still interesting that um all our thinking and identifications apparently depend on that, but we don't learn that until later. So I'm just sort of getting my head around that. Maybe
Yeah,
because
or
it's so
like,
abstract. I don't know. But anyway, I'll have to think about it more, I think.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
like facts. Like facts are, regardless of what you understand, the facts are still out there. You have to discover them. Whether or not you realize them is a different question or a different issue.
yeah. Facts are out there. You just need to discover them. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Let's see what this is. Okay, this is about reduction and integration. And my question, we can go to question, then I'll read the section. Like, why both reduction and integration? Like, assuming you derive everything from reality when you're forming a concept. If you perfectly reduce everything, won't it be true? Like, okay, so let me go to this section. The epistemological responsibility imposed on man by the fact that knowledge is contextual is the need of integration. Okay. The responsibility imposed by the fact that knowledge is hierarchical is the need of reduction. And then I'll skip to this. Under these conditions, an individual could not reach or use a higher level item without knowing its tie to perceptual reality. The ideas of such a mind would never become floating abstractions. So he's saying reduction and integration is a double check on accuracy. Must stand the test of his other knowledge and, through the necessary intermediate chain, the test of direct experience. My question is, why both? Like, if you're deriving, like, why do we need a double check on knowledge?
Let's see. Well, I think you just have to double check anyway. I mean, integration is necessary if you want to think. You're integrating the perceptual data in order to think. And so if you integrated that, then then you could be sure that it refers to something in reality. But then you could also check that in turn by then just taking it apart again, saying, can you take away all those parts and split those parts up and get restarted? I don't think it's saying much more than that. Like, you can put it together and take it apart, and it'll get the same thing.
I form a concept and I formed it using objectivity, and then I integrate it. Why do I then need to reduce it? I guess that's so I guess we're saying contextual integration is a must in thinking because part of thinking includes finding implications, right? It's asking the question, so what? So you're taking something you've discovered, you're going, so what? And then you're making connections to all your other knowledge. And in that process, you may identify contradictions. But then why do I need to reduce it if I've done that? So I've derived the concept from, this is all theoretical, but I'm still like, I'm still confused. If I'm confused about that, maybe I'm missing something about the process.
I mean, I guess I would say fallibility is the only reason. Like you could say you claim to refer to encirclist again. You could say, oh, I integrate these things, I've got encirclist, but then you'd quickly realize you can't reduce it in that. But yeah, I mean, if you did objectivity correctly, yeah, you wouldn't need to, but how do you know you did it correctly? Well, you can reduce it and, oh yeah, I did it correctly because it reduced. You can say that I'm correct.
Oh, okay. I
That's
guess
what I would say.
you could make the argument that going into the future, and you're looking back, you want to look at a concept that you previously formed from the past. Our memory fails us sometimes and we're fallible. And so if you want to, you can't remember if you exactly did this or you didn't like you formed it, but you're not 100%. You can't be 100% sure in the past, like 4 years back, if you did it correctly, because you just forget details. And so you still have to wait to validate it. So maybe you've contextually integrated it, but you haven't. You can now reduce it as a double check. Maybe that's it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say just a double check is just a way to be sure. Like if you need to confirm something, or if you had a reason to doubt what you did, like if you learned something new, you might say, "Well, I want to go back again, take what I learned now, see if it still reduces." Things like that.
Yeah, because we're fallible and we forget, and our memory fails us.
Yeah, and even just learning new things.
What do you mean, even just learning new?
Well, if you learn new things, you have new information that might then make it so you can't reduce it anymore. Like there might be some facts like, well, that's not true because I realize this now. I think I've learned this, so I can't reduce in that way. Like if like whatever your old way was, you might this time you might realize that you made a mistake.
I
or
didn't
that.
follow that.
Well, it's when you take in new information, sometimes that changes what you used to think. That's all.
Yeah, but like if you're learning something new, you can, if you're doing it then and there, you're basically, I guess, if you're forming it, you're validating then and there. You know what I'm saying? That you're doing you're almost, because you're starting from the ground up. But I can see where, and then so you're already like you're not reducing, you're doing the opposite of reducing, which is beginning from observations to form the concept. So in a way, that is the validation, I think.
Yes.
And then
Right.
the only thing that's left is the contextual integration. So there's no reduction in the process of forming a concept, maybe, but in the future, like yeah, when you want to look back at something you learned and you can't remember, then it maybe. Anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah,
That sounds good.
cool. Let's see what the other things are here. Um, amend his former claims. Oh, the same thing of contextual integration. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, what's that? Is it possible to have something contextually integrated, but that cannot
I
be
don't know.
reduced? Well, it would be a misintegration, right? Like the encirclist might be. Could you, or would you eventually identify an integration? Would you identify, sorry, a contradiction? If I like contextually, and I don't know what it would even mean to fully contextually integrate circle. That's sort of what I'm getting at. Like, if I'm contextually integrated, if I contextually integrate encirclist, would I identify a contradiction? Would I need to reduce it? Do you get where this question is going, right? I'm trying to figure out the boundaries of the balloon, to use your analogy.
Yeah, contextually integrated. I guess you could say misintegration would work because it's an attempt to integrate, but it fails on objectivity, or it fails, well, it has contradictions, or it fails in some way. It fails in some way to meet the requirements of objectivity.
Well, in this case, remember the requirements of objectivity are contextual integration and reduction and adherence to logics. So then the question is it possible? It's still, the question still remains, I think, of like, can you have something that is fully contextually integrated but can't be reduced? Like it just doesn't contradict any other knowledge you have.
No, I don't think so. I think if it couldn't be reduced, then it's been misintegrated, or there's a contradiction, or any of those things. But you couldn't have an objective, contextually integrated thing that can't be reduced. If it can't be reduced, there's something wrong with it.
Yeah. Where would, can you think of like in Circlist, where would the contradiction be if I didn't reduce it but just
You could almost be ignoring context, like why are you even combining these things? And that could be one thing you could look at. I mean, if there were some valid reason to do so, then you could say maybe that's proper. But insofar as you're not really taking anything about reality, you're just the random associations. It's not, you're not really reducing the concept. You're just, there's problems with the concept to begin with. And that's part of the issue as well.
I think I'm going to come back to that maybe later, not immediately, but it's if I could identify exactly where, that would be interesting. But
yeah. Sorry about that.
Hey, that's fine. I'm just reading through the next question. Okay, so this is about, I'm again trying to explore this idea of context. So hierarchy is one aspect. And then I think what was the other? There's hierarchy and, well, hierarchy is one aspect of context. What are other aspects of context?
Well, time and place.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, you said, what was that original formulation? Something W's. It was all W's.
Yeah, use the 5 W's. Who, what, where, when, why.
W's. Who, what, when, where. Is that a journalism thing? I think I've seen
It
that
is.
before. Yeah.
It is.
Cool. I've seen that somewhere. Cool. That's good that they formulated it that way. I like it. But I guess who, what, when, where, why doesn't capture the hierarchy.
It doesn't, right. It doesn't capture everything.
Yeah. All right. So I'll still, I think at some point later in the future, I want to come back to that as well. What's this next thing? I'm just trying to figure out what I was trying to get at here. Okay, because he gave an example of an error that you could identify through reduction, because you know the hierarchy of the relationship of friend to volition to esteem to those other concepts, and so you can identify misuse by understanding what goes into that concept. And I was curious about, I wonder if there are examples of like conceptual errors that involve a lack of contextual integration, not an issue with reduction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think a conceptual error could be taking into account more details than you really need, like over focusing on the details. Like every little detail would be a conceptual error in the sense that you are taking more in than you really need to, or taking more in than the actual question. You've not created a context. You just took everything rather than just trying to like set the boundaries with your context.
Okay. All right. That's sort of like that example that Kickoff gave in the earlier on about, when you're asking questions in philosophy, you can go on this run-off train of random questions. Well, who's to say she's right anyway? How do we know we have free will and all that stuff?
Things like that, yes. Like
yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess even that's a skill. Okay. Maybe this is for the epistemology book, but he's like, the antidote is the process of reduction. Reduction completes the job of definition. I was like, what does that mean? But maybe I think I've seen that somewhere in the epistemology section, which I started reading. So do you reckon we should skip that and that's going to be covered in epistemology?
Yeah, the definition is, yes.
Okay, cool. I'll just paste that out to when I get to epistemology.
Yeah. Hierarchy is a type of context. Yes, we got that.
All right, let's see. What am I asking here? Okay. Every non-axiomatic item has a context. So axiomatic items are the context? Is that because they don't have a context? They're outside of context almost, right?
Because they're everywhere, literally in existence.
Yes.
Like it's literally everything that exists. So
Right.
it's hard to even talk about as a context if it's literally every single thing.
Yeah. So they're almost not outside of context.
Yeah. They're special cases, like I mentioned yesterday.
Oh, this is off topic, but it's related to, I remember when I was reading that thread and David said something about like axiomatic references. And I was like, could you have anything that's perceptual, that is just like an entity and you point to, could you say that's axiomatic? Like, am I using that rightly? Like it's an axiomatic percept or reducing to the axiomatic? Is that what
I
that is?
wouldn't call that an axiomatic percept. I mean,
Okay.
because it's not like what we're saying, it's presupposed by everything you know. I mean, yeah, it's not a particular either. It's not like you can point out because it's like if everything depends on it, then it couldn't be just one thing probably.
Yeah, I've seen it used elsewhere. That was the confusion. I've seen it used in a different way. I think that was the confusion for me. Um, okay, this is a set repeat of the same question. Is hierarchy the most important aspect of? I'm going to have to come back to these. There's a lot of confusion around this topic.
Let me say one thing about hierarchy and context. You could think of it like philosophy could be one level of hierarchy. Biology could be another sense of hierarchy in the sense that like philosophy comes first.
Yeah.
And then you could say physics comes after that at some point. Then like chemistry rests on physics or biology rests on chemistry. And each one's a little, the closer you get towards the philosophy, the more abstract it is. And that in a way that you could say that's hierarchy because if you're talking about, say, how cells divide, you're focusing on just that level of abstraction on biology and you're not trying to talk about everything about physics at that time. But you're focusing on just the cell division and how do you abstract away those details of physics is the difficulty about figuring out the context, but you can know that you're focusing on biology rather than physics.
I'm sorry, I didn't fully follow that. So we're talking about fields of study in a hierarchy, and you're saying
Yeah.
philosophy is at the bottom of the hierarchy, or?
Well, bottom in the sense that it's the most abstract. It's the
Okay.
most fundamental.
Okay. And then what were you saying? I didn't fully follow what you were saying. And like you study division of cells, and then
Like biology would be dependent on the discoveries of chemistry and physics and other fields. Like it's a different hierarchy, not that it's more or less important, just that it's a different level of thinking
then philosophy or physics.
than philosophy or physics. Like
Oh,
they
okay.
both take into account
What?
different questions and different levels of abstraction.
So, could you give me an example? So biology is less abstract than physics.
In the sense that you're dealing with more concrete things in front of you, everyday things,
Okay.
as opposed to physics, like you're talking about like planetary bodies and things like that, which you have no day-to-day experience with. And it's more abstract because it's further away from your experiences, further away from your day-to-day understanding.
Where would art fit in this hierarchy of fields?
That's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say exactly where level of abstraction that would be. But it would be more towards perceptual things because art is about things you see, things you hear, things you taste.
I'm asking because I remember in that group I was in where they talked about the Romantic Manifesto and art. They were saying that a lot of the time art came before the development of philosophy. So I guess that would be a chronological rather than a hierarchical or logical. I'm still, logical rather than a logical hierarchy. It would be a chronological, one of chronological development.
Yeah, that sounds fair. Yeah.